Let's start with our next topic, that is custom connectors. So in this section, only one topic we are going to cover, which is custom connectors. So we would learn how to create a custom connector also. So when we talk about connectors, definitely you would be able to relate it when we have worked around Power Automate, we have connected with various connectors. So what is the importance of connectors? Basically, connectors help make it easier for app and flow makers to connect with other apps, data, and devices in the cloud. How? Because connection is done in a consistent, repeatable way that is discoverable by makers, right? In addition, it also helps with the actions that allow makers to control when an operation is performed. They have triggers that allow automation to start when triggering event occurs. So therefore, when we are talking about connectors, we are having the thoughts around triggers, actions, and connecting with the data. Now, here we are going to learn custom connector. So what is custom connector? Basically, custom connector is like a wrapper, or you would say connector is like a wrapper. Just see here, this wrapper. Around what? Around an API, so that you can easily connect with that API. And that connector we are making use in Power Automate or Canvas based application or Logic apps. So custom connector, if I'm creating, so there must be some API and we are going to create a wrapper around that API. That is custom connector. So I have already told you that a custom connector is a wrapper, or you can say is a proxy around an API that allows Power Automate, Power Apps, and Logic apps to communicate with underlying API service. Many connectors are predefined and are available for use without you having to define anything. Those are built-in connectors, and these built-in connector definition, just a moment. These built-in connector definitions include services from Microsoft and others. When the service or API that you want to use does not have a pre-built connector, you can create your own custom connector. So if a pre-built connector doesn't expose all triggers and actions that you need from the API, you can build a custom connector in addition to the available one to handle these extra requirements. After the custom connector has been defined, it becomes available for use when you are building apps and flows in that environment, like built-in connectors. So basically, what you are supposed to perform to create custom connector, the lifecycle, identify or build API, describe the API, then use the connector, and if you want, you can make it certify or make it open source connector. So the first task is to check the connector reference to determine if a suitable connector already exists for the API or that service. If a suitable connector doesn't already exist, then you can make your own custom connector. You can define custom connector to describe any REST API that is public or private. If you talk about private APIs require the on-premises data gateway to access internal resources. So that is our first step, identify the API. The next step, so build the API. So basically, if a compatible API doesn't exist, developers can build one by using any technology of choice that is capable of hosting a REST API, including Microsoft Azure Functions and Azure App Services. You can also use Azure API management to increase manageability and governance of the APIs. So basically, you are supposed to create an API. You can use Azure Functions and Azure App Service. So here I have mentioned on the slide, Azure Functions can be used to create APIs that can be described by custom connector. So that is our second step. Now, third steps talks about describing the API, where you are looking at different approaches to create the custom connector. You can go for custom connector wizard. You can go for import API definition, import Postman collections, import from GitHub, or create from Azure API management. Basically, for Power Apps and Power Automate to discover what triggers and actions are available from API, you must identify them when you create your own custom connector. You can accomplish this task by manually editing the connector definition in the Maker portal or by importing a definition in a supported format. This process includes identifying the authentication requirement for the API. And to define a connector's actions and triggers, you need to describe the connector. A custom connector can be defined by describing only the API triggers and actions that you need. For example, if an API has 100 actions and 10 triggers that are available, you could build a custom connector with a single action. You can also describe later as you need. Okay, so when you describe the API, you will use at least one of the following approaches, which I have highlighted. If you choose to import either an open API definition or Postman collection, you can still manually manipulate your connector definition in the portal. So when you're doing manually creation of the custom connector in portal, so using this approach, you would use the API documentation and examples of inputs and outputs that defines each action and trigger. And this approach is good for sample APIs where you don't have the ability to import the definition. You can also use this approach to refine the definition after you import them. If we talk about Open API definition only, Open API is a specification that describes REST, simplifying the task of developing and consuming an API by effectively mapping all resources and operations that are associated with it. Many APIs publish an Open API definition, and you can import it to describe the API in custom connector. This approach is beneficial if an open API definition is available from the API publisher, or if you're developing the API, you can publish one. However, if we talk about the Postman collection, Postman is a tool for testing REST API. You can use this tool to perform the action on the API that you want to describe and then save them as Postman collection. This collection is then imported to describe the API in custom connector, and this way you can work. The other option, import from GitHub, import connectors from Power Platform Connector repository. This is the best approach when there is already a connector published in the repository and you want to import it or to modify or use it as custom connector. And the last option, which you can look for, export from Azure. If your API is built as an Azure App Service, Azure function, or is managed by Azure API management, you can export from those services and it will be automatically create the initial custom connector definition. So this is the way you would be looking for your custom connector definitions. Once custom connector has been created, you can use your custom connector as the same way any built-in connector you use. Okay, so use your custom connector now. Even the custom connector can be shared also. So These connectors can be shared with other users in your organization the same way you share resources in Power Apps, Power Automate, and Azure Logic Apps. Okay, so these are also shareable. Even one thing I would like you, if you wanted to have a certification, so basically you can submit the connector for Microsoft certification as well. During this process, Microsoft review the connector, checks for technical and content compliances, and validates functionality for Power Apps, Power Automate, and Azure Logic apps. And if it is justified, then it would make your connector also certified. I would like to highlight one thing. When you are describing your custom connector, you should configure the API security. So how a custom connector authenticates to the API? These are the four options. No authentication. Okay, so this choice is for APIs that allows anonymous access, and it's the default if you don't configure a specific authentication type. Second option is basic authentication. This choice is for APIs that require a username and password to be sent with each request. The third option, OAuth 2.0, which is the industry standard protocol for authorization. And this option can be configured for any API that uses OAuth 2.0. Even pre-built configurations are available for you to select from the Microsoft services like Azure Active Directory, GitHub, or Azure DevOps. Similar pre-built configurations are available for other services as well. So the pre-built configuration simplify what you need to provide to configure the identity provider. And the last option, API key. So an API key is a token that a client provides when making API call. So the API publisher typically provides the key, and it must be included in each request for the custom connector. So these are the options for authentication or authenticating your API. Azure functions can be used for business logic and can be easily consumed as custom connectors. The Azure functions must use the HTTP trigger in such a situation. After the Azure function has been created, it will generate the URL, endpoint, and API key, which we can use. Okay, so you can authenticate either by using API key or by using Azure Active Directory. Then you can then create the custom connector by using API M, which is described in the next part of it. Okay, so basically you can use custom connector wizard, or you can go for this APIM. But in this particular session, we are not covering about APIM. You can go through the articles around that. We would be only covering the custom connector wizard. And when you use Azure function, you should be using HTTP trigger, and you can authenticate your function either using API key or Azure AD. So for the demonstration purpose, I'm again going to show you a video. So let's watch a video.
Hello there, it's Joe, the CRM chap here, and we're back with a new video in my series all about Microsoft Exam PL400. This is the developer's exam for those who are looking to validate their skills in building solutions on top of, or indeed extending out the Power Platform. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at custom connectors. Now, these give you a really nice way in which you can bring in any sort of custom API, maybe it's one based in the cloud or one on premise, into the Power Platform, so you can actually use it amongst tools such as, let's say, a Canvas app, maybe a Power Automate flow, or even as part of something like Logic Apps. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you the process and how you go about creating a custom connector, and we're going to sort of do this by building a very sort of simple Azure function, and then go through the steps on how we then incorporate that as part of our custom connector. So I'm in the Maker portal at the moment, as you can see, but I just need to jump out first of all into Azure. And that what I want to do is create a new resource, and it's going to be of type Azure Function. Let's just find it on the list here. There it is, Function App. I'm just going to create that. I'll just call this my PL400 Function App. I'll just put my initials on there just to make sure it's unique. In this case, we can make this a .NET 3.1 application, and I'll just make sure it's in the region I'm in currently, which is UK South. So I'm just going to review and create that. It will take a few moments just to create. Once it's finished validating, there shouldn't be any issues on here, but let's just wait a second and see. Okay, all good. So I'm going to hit create down there. It's going to take a few minutes now just to push this out. So let's just give it a minute or two just to complete. Okay, so that's all done and dusted. So I'm going to hit on go to resource to open up the function app. And instead of typically what we would do with the function app is that we maybe use Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code to build out the code. But for the purpose of the example, we're just going to go straight in and code it this way. This wouldn't really be the recommended way in which I would suggest that we go about doing this. So what I'm going to do is going to click on add up here, and I'm just going to call this our sort of PL400 sort of sample. We want to make sure this is a HTTP trigger because we're going to be calling this via API. And then we just need to give some details down here. So I'll just call this my PL400 calculation. And we can leave everything else there as the default settings. So I click on add. That's going to add in my sort of function app ready to sort of go. And when it's there, I can just hit refresh on here. There it is. I can click straight into there, click on code and test, and it will allow me to actually start building out the code. We can see we get a C# class file on here, or CSX file that we can start to work with. So there's some stuff that's here that we can leverage already, and some stuff that we want to sort of replace. So in this example, what we want to do is just want to add on a couple of using statements because we're going to be using some additional libraries, including a link library from Newtonsoft. We need to add in a sort of a class that we want. So I'm going to put this underneath my main function down here. So I'm just going to call this public class. I'll just call this calc request, like so. I'll just paste in the attributes like so. Just get it looking tidy as well. Otherwise, my OCD will go a little bit crazy. Okay, so that's done. We now just need to clean up the run method. So everything that's below the first sort of log statement on here, we don't really sort of want. So let's just get rid of that completely and start fresh. Then from here, what we want to do, we're going to be effectively receiving a request of some data in. There's going to be these data points on here. We're going to consume that data and then return sort of the output of the calculation based on that. So I just want to add in my request body first of all. We need to then declare a new instance of our calc request like so. So we're just going to convert that from JSON, just deserialize that object. So something like this we will use. And then we just take in our request body. Then we actually perform the calculation. So in this case, I can just paste in some additional code on here, which will do all of that. We'll also just log that back out just so we can keep an eye on it and make sure it's doing what we think we want it to do. And then at the back end of it, we just return return that as a sort of object. So in this case, I just want to do return new action result. It's going to be an OK, just so we know that it's completed successfully. And we just want to return a new sort of CPM equals CPM, like so. I just need to make sure that's capitalized. Okay, and so now we've got a function app. We've got our API, which is good and ready to go. So we're going to leave this tab open because we're going to need to come back here in a few minutes. But as a next step, we can now jump back into the Maker portal and we can start to build out our custom connector. So typically we do this by going down to custom connectors in the list on the left-hand side. We can see we've got a new button up here. We'd also maybe want to make sure we're working in the context of a solution. In fact, let's do the best practice thing from the start. Let's work from a solution. That is usually probably the best thing to do. So let's do that first. So into our solution, click on New at the top, and we should see that we've got an option somewhere on here for custom connector, like so. So hit that button. Now we need to sort of specify some settings for this. So in this case, I'm going to call this my sort of PL400 calculator. Typically, we maybe want to give a description or maybe adjust the sort of the background image like so. Scheme will typically always be HTTPS unless you have got an unsecure sort of endpoint like so. And what we need to do now is actually put in the URL from our sort of function app. So I can get this by going to get function app up here. I can say I get the full path there for the particular function. I just want to extract out the URL portion of that, which I'm just doing on the other screen. So I just want to get that in. Remove the HTTPS at the end, like so. Base URL we can sort of leave as default. At this point, I just want to go on to the onto the next step by clicking on security. Now you've got a few options on here. So typically you can maybe just have it so that there's no authentication or use basic or API key. OAuth 2 is probably the one you're going to want to go for in most scenarios, but you may have a older or in this case an API that only supports a specific authentication option. So in the case of our function app, it's going to be an API key because we're sort of just creating this quickly from the sort of the portal. So I'm going to select API key as my option. I'm going to give it a name of API key like so. The parameter name is going to be code, and this is something that we're going to include as part of the URL, i.e. it's going to be a sort of query parameter on there. So with that done, we can then move on to definition, and we can now build out the various different actions that we want for the API. But I just want to first of all just save my changes so I don't lose them by clicking on Create Connector at the top. It'll take just a few moments to save. Okay, so with that saved, then I can now define things such as the actions, so the types of operations that my API can perform. If my connector wants to sort of trigger our connector based on what's going on in the external system, then we can also set that up as well. That's not something we're going to cover on this today. We've also got the ability to do references and policies as well. But as I say, for now, we're just going to build out a single action for a particular API. So in this case, it's going to be PL400 calculator. Typically, you want to make sure you put a description in. We won't bother in this particular case. I'm just going to call this particular operation get required CPM like so. Now, to help us in terms of defining, okay, what the request and response, what the core data bits are for our API, we can actually just import in an example of what it's going to be fed through each time. So in this case, what I can do is define what the sample request looks like. So it's going to be a post. It's going to be this full endpoint on here that is queried, like so. No headers that we need to specify, and then all we're doing is just providing a JSON body object, which looks a little bit like this. I can then click on import. It's going to go off and sort of just define all that for me, like so, which is quite nice. And then likewise, we can do the same for the default response. So in this case, we're just expecting just a single value back in a JSON string to CPM. No headers that we need to potentially work with as well. So again, I can just add that in, click on import. It's going to build out my sort of default response for that as well. And that's everything ready to go. I can actually now just click on update connector at the top just to get that saved, and we can actually give this a bit of a test now. So just give that a second to save. So to test it then, what we do is we go to test at the top, obviously, and then we first of all need to define a connection for the security options that we defined earlier. So a connection is always separate from the type of connection type that we sort of specify. So in this case, what we need to do is just create a connection and just give the API key that we're going to be using for this function app. So again, I'm just going to paste this in from the URL I got from Azure a few seconds ago. It'll then just go off and create that for us. I might just need to click the refresh button to sort of select it like so. And then what we can do is actually just give this a quick test as well, which is quite useful. So in this case, what I want to do is maybe just specify, let's say 20, 25, maybe have a length of 10, and then maybe do air changes, let's say 5 again as example. Hit the test operation button. It's going to go off and contact our function app. And in this case, we do get a bit of an error message. So it might be we just need to check some of the properties that we're supplying. So I'll just be back in 2 seconds once I've got this fixed. Okay, so in this case, it's actually an issue in my code. So in true fashion, I forgot to do a semicolon at the end there. So let's just hit save, and hopefully then these errors down here will sort of vanish. Yep, okay, that's compiled successfully. Let's run another test now, and just hopefully that will then just complete without any problems whatsoever. Yes, it has. So indeed, we get a response back straight away 416, which confirms that our custom connector is working as we want it to. So at this point, then I can then just hit update connector and close that off. And what we've now built out is available for me to use on this particular environment that's set up. So I can potentially start to leverage this as part of, let's say, as I said earlier, maybe a Canvas app, maybe a Power Automate flow. It really is up to me what I want to do on there. So as an example, then, if I was to just close this down again, maybe let's go back into our solution and just create a new sort of cloud flow. I'll give you an example here in terms of how that experience looks. So I'm just going to not too concerned about the trigger action on here. So I'll just do manually trigger. If I go down here, now if I start to search for connectors, we should see that our PL400 calculator appears in the list down there. And I can just sort of call that. I can see it's asking me to specify a connection. So let me just do that again in terms of setting up the connection based on the API key that I've got for the function app. Paste that in like so, create that. And in this case, it's brought through the single action that is available on there. And again, I can put in any data that I want on here. I'm not going to be too concerned about what is here. And this will work in much the same way as our test was a few seconds ago. So once this is saved, I'll be able to just run this flow or just trigger this flow. And we'll be able to just confirm that the values get sent through successfully. So yeah, that's saved now. Let me just do a manual trigger on that one. Click on continue to run it, run the flow, close that down, and we should see our results coming back from the test in a second. It might be that we just need to go back up to here first. Yeah, there we go. Test succeeded down there. So this is really good. So now I've got a connector that I can use throughout my particular environment. If I did want potentially other users to start working with this, then what I can do is I can go into my back into my Maker portal, go to custom connectors up here. I can see I've got the connector available in here. I could maybe choose to invite other users in the tenant to maybe start working with it. So therefore they can then start to use it alongside their flows and their Canvas apps potentially. Or, if I'm an ISV, independent solution vendor, and I'm wanting to make this connector more generally available, to my customers, then I can go through the certification process and get this rolled out so that anybody in anywhere in the globe using the Power Platform can leverage it. So you've got some really nice options here with your custom connectors that can suit both internal and potentially external sort of requirements for your connector. And as we saw, it's really, really easy to actually get one set up. You don't have to be an expert around it. And potentially the steps that we saw, you could look to even automate them if you've got, let's say, a Postman collection or an OpenAPI file. You just import that instead again, and again, all these steps will be automated for you, and your custom connector will be sat there, ready to go. So I hope this video has been useful in terms of your exam prep or just showing you how custom connectors work. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe and follow along with the series. There's a whole load of videos covering all of the different topics in the PL400 exam, and also more to come as well. So it'd be great to have you along for the journey. All leaves me to say for now is thanks again and take care. Cheers.
So in today's session, what we have learned plugins that are powerful methods that you can use to extend business logic with Microsoft Dataverse. We have also learned plugin interact with event pipeline and provides an execution context that enables you to handle scenarios that otherwise might not have been accomplished through declarative means. We have seen Microsoft Dataverse has a wealth of pre-built methods of interacting with Azure solutions. Azure can be used to distribute workloads away from your Dataverse environment. So we have actually learned the integration of Dataverse and Azure. So we have also seen the Dataverse provides many ways to integrate with external systems. Then we have started with custom connectors. So we learned that in the custom connector, we have to describe the REST API, and the custom connectors can be used like any other connector in Canvas apps or Power Automate cloud flows. Even Azure functions with HTTP triggers can be consumed using custom connectors. So I believe you're able to recall the pointers which we have covered during the session.